historical explanation of how Asian American as a term came to be. We no longer say the term Oriental. There's a very specific history through which that term was thrown out. And we can think of that as a racial project, right? Eileen O'Brien talks about the specific history of 1960s contestation and the active social movement of the Yellow Power movement to displace the term Oriental, which is so related to the operations of U.S. empire abroad. And instead think about Asian American, centering, number one, the sort of inter-ethnic struggle of uniting in solidarity, and also talking about the racial realities. Also on page 11 is a similar conversation about the differences between the term Hispanic and Latino. Hispanic refers to a particular language group in terms of its history as a term, whereas Latino refers to a specific racial formation within the United States. On page 10, an important thing that we'll think about is the interplay between race and ethnicity, and how both of these terms, not one or the other, are very significant in talking about Asian Pacific American and US Latino experiences. Alright, so there are three key definitions to think about. Number one is the whitening thesis from page 12. Number two is the browning thesis from page 14. And number three is racial trichotomy from page 16. So these three terms, whitening thesis, browning thesis, and racial trichotomy, all speak of different ways in which people have tried to understand what Asian Pacific American and Latino difference means, right? The whitening thesis might be a little bit familiar to some of you. The idea that Alright, so the battery ran out, so that lets me know that I have to go a little bit faster in order to finish this lecture. Alright, so thank you for keeping with me. Alright, so where we left off, we were talking about the whitening thesis, the browning thesis, and racial trichotomy. Three different theories that policymakers, sociologists, and intellectuals have had to talk about racial difference, and the ways in which racial difference will work itself out throughout U.S. culture and society and economics, right? So the whitening thesis perhaps is a little bit more familiar. The idea that all groups will assimilate over the course of generations. This theory has been out there long enough to see how it's not necessarily proven, but not necessarily disproven. Each racial group, and for that matter, each ethnic group, has its own certain experience with being incorporated into the U.S. mainstream. Sometimes it's a smooth transition, and other times it's not. Then there's the discussion of the browning thesis. The browning thesis referring to how, as racial minority groups grow, there will be a browning where majority power will no longer be able to dictate the meanings of racial formation and race, will no longer control the means of material racialization. However, we've seen that this is overly optimistic because, for example, we can think of places where the number of people from non-white majority groups has grown, but at the same time, this has not changed the nature of racism. We can think of what's happening in Arizona as an example of where the browning thesis perhaps is a little too optimistic. So sheer numbers alone will not cause a change in anti-racism. And finally, we have racial trichotomy, the theory that it's not just about racial privilege versus racial disadvantage, but thinking about different layers within a hierarchy. So the example that's listed is racially white, honorary white, and categorically black, as ways of naming different levels of enfranchisement and material privilege and ideological control. So thinking about those as dimensions of racial privilege and disadvantage, where Asian Pacific Americans and US Latinos inhabit the middleman minority category in between racial privilege and racial disadvantage. So throughout the course, we'll be playing with these three different theses and thinking about how they do and don't apply to the demographic realities of Asian Pacific Americans and US Latinos. So that's pages 12 through 17. So pages 18 through 27 really focus on O'Brien's methods in the book where I drew the introduction from. You don't have to pay attention to those, skim them. Skim them because there are some important issues that come up that refer to the differences that affect Asian Pacific Americans and US Latinos. For example, there's the discussion of generation. Talking about the first generation, the group that came from another country or from another location. The first generation of Americans. The 1.5 generation, those who immigrated or were displaced at an early age and thus have experiences of both countries. We can also think of the second generation, third generation, and fourth generation, these more traditional categories that we have within our lexicon for talking about ethnic difference and immigration. Also important is intraracial difference, right? So we've been talking a lot about interracial difference, differences between white, Asian Pacific American, US Latino, African American, and Indigenous. But within these categories, there are also differences. For example, there's the discussion about population size, how Asian Pacific Americans have kind of a gradation of Chinese Americans being the most numerically present, followed by South Asians and Filipinos. So it's important to think about this interplay of race and ethnicity, not just for how people understand themselves, but also how this plays out over the course of the population itself. And finally, there's the issue of interracial contact. There's the discussion about intermarriage, right? Marrying outside of your race. There's also the discussion of transracial adoptees. There's the specific discussion that briefly touches upon, for example, Korean adoptees. This mostly happened in the late 80s and early 90s, so this generation is coming of age and experiencing racial difference from inside a multiracial family. So pages 27 to 28 introduces the book itself. Again, pay attention to what she talks about. There's some key points that are useful. For example, talking about the specific forms of interpersonal racism that Asian Pacific Americans and US Latinos experience. Right? Interpersonal, like referring to interactions with each other. On the one hand, there's language discrimination. For example, the demonization of the accent. That's a specific form of racism. And on the other hand, there's presumptions of foreignness. That says something very specific about how we construct who is and is not American. We say it's for everyone, but then we also have to question ourselves and think about the times when we assume that someone else is foreign. So that's it for racial formation and for the specificities of Asian Pacific American and US Latino difference. We'll continue talking and unpacking these issues throughout the semester, but this is kind of a brief run-through introduction. Thank you very much. Don't forget to post on the Blackboard for all of you enrolled in the class, and see you later.